Long ago, in the hills and valleys of ancient Israel, two nations stood on the edge of war. On one side stood Israel. On the other stood the Philistines. For generations, these two nations had fought for land, influence, and survival. But this time felt different. This time, nobody moved. No swords clashed. No armies charged. Instead, both sides stood frozen, waiting. Because in the middle of the battlefield stood something that looked impossible. His name was Goliath. And he was unlike anyone the Israelites had ever faced. Goliath was enormous. A giant warrior from the Philistine army. His height alone was enough to make people uncomfortable. But it wasn't just his size. It was the way he carried himself. The confidence. The experience. The armor. His bronze helmet reflected sunlight across the valley. Heavy armor covered his body. His spear looked more like a tree branch than a weapon. Every step felt deliberate. Every movement announced power. And every day, Goliath walked into the valley and shouted the same challenge. Choose one man. If he defeats me, we will serve you. But if I defeat him, you will serve us.
One battle. One champion. One outcome. Simple, at least in theory. But nobody accepted. Day after day, Goliath returned. Morning after morning, his voice echoed through the valley. And every day, Israel remained silent. The soldiers lowered their eyes. The camp grew quieter. Even King Saul, the tallest and strongest leader among Israel's people, had no answer. At first, people hoped someone would volunteer. Then, they hoped the Philistines would leave. Eventually, they stopped hoping. Fear settled over the camp like a shadow. Conversations became shorter. Confidence disappeared. People started believing something dangerous. That defeat was unavoidable. 40 days passed. 40 mornings. 40 evenings. The giant kept speaking. And Israel kept listening. Until someone arrived who saw things differently. Not a warrior. Not a general. Not a king. A shepherd. Far from the battlefield, life looked completely different. Rolling hills stretched across the countryside. Sheep moved slowly across green fields. Wind passed through trees. And among those quiet hills lived a young man named David. David was not famous. He wasn't rich. He wasn't trained for war. If someone had asked people in his village who would become a hero, his name probably wouldn't have been mentioned. He was the youngest in his family. His older brothers were soldiers. David stayed behind. His job was simple. Take care of the sheep. Wake up early. Lead the flock. Find water. Protect them. Return home. Then do it again tomorrow. Ordinary. Quiet. But ordinary life has a way of teaching extraordinary lessons. David learned patience, responsibility, observation, and courage. Because protecting sheep wasn't always peaceful. Predators came. Storms came. Long, lonely days came. And in those moments, David learned something important. Responsibility means standing your ground even when nobody is watching. One day, danger came suddenly. A wild animal attacked the flock. Panic spread. Sheep scattered. Most people would protect themselves first. David didn't. He moved toward danger. Not because he felt fearless, but because those sheep had been entrusted to him. Later, David would remember those moments. How fear felt.
how courage worked, how strength wasn't always loud. Because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding something else matters more. That became part of who David was. His days weren't filled with applause. Nobody celebrated him. Nobody called him brave. Most people simply saw a shepherd. But unseen moments often prepare people for visible moments. David spent time alone, thinking, reflecting, playing music, trusting God, learning quiet confidence. And while armies worried about giants, David was becoming someone prepared for challenges he didn't even know were coming. Then, one morning, everything changed. David's father, Jesse, called him. "Your brothers are with the army. Take food to them." Simple enough. Deliver supplies, check on them, come back. No dramatic mission, no special announcement, just a normal task. David packed bread, prepared grain, loaded supplies, and started walking. The road stretched through hills and open land. As he traveled, the atmosphere slowly changed. Fewer farmers, more travelers, more tension. Eventually, he began seeing smoke, military tents, movement, the sounds of preparation. The battlefield. When David arrived at Israel's camp, soldiers moved everywhere. Armor clinked, voices echoed, people rushed from place to place. But something felt strange. This didn't feel like an army preparing to win. It felt like people waiting for something they feared. David found his brothers, greeted them, delivered supplies, asked questions. Then suddenly, everything stopped. A deep voice rolled across the valley, loud, confident, mocking. David turned and saw him. Goliath. The giant stepped forward from the Philistine side. His armor shined. His spear rested in his hand. His presence filled the valley. Then he shouted again, "Choose your champion. Send someone to fight." Silence. Nobody moved. David looked around. Soldiers avoided eye contact. Some stepped backward. Others looked down. The giant finished speaking and waited. Still, nothing. Eventually, Goliath laughed, turned around, and walked back. David stared in disbelief. He looked at the soldiers, looked at his brothers, and asked, "What just happened?" One soldier answered quietly, "He does this every day." David frowned. "And nobody fights?" The soldier looked uncomfortable. Another shrugged. Someone else muttered, "Look at him." David looked back toward the valley. Yes, Goliath was enormous, dangerous, intimidating. But David noticed something nobody else seemed to notice. The battle hadn't even started, yet everyone had already accepted defeat. That confused him. His older brother overheard him asking questions. Immediately, he became irritated. "What are you doing here? Go back home. You came to watch."
Why have you come down here? Who did
David
you leave
looked
the sheep
surprised.
with? I know your pride
I'm
and the
only asking.
wickedness of your heart.
But his
What
brother
have I done?
dismissed him. The conversation ended. Still, David couldn't stop thinking. He looked around again. Hundreds of soldiers. Weapons. Training. Experience. And yet nobody was willing to move. Not because they lacked strength. Because they had lost courage. And something inside David began to shift. Not pride, not excitement, just a simple question. What if someone stood up? What if fear wasn't supposed to decide the outcome? What if the giant wasn't unbeatable? For the first time, David started imagining something nobody else could imagine.